we have here today Professor Robert Harrison from Stanford University, who has kindly agreed to share with us his memories and his thoughts on Professor René Girard. So thank you, Professor Harrison. And let me start off by asking you, when did you first hear about Professor René Girard? Was it before he came to Stanford, or was it when he came to Stanford?
It's before I came to Stanford at our alma mater, Cornell University, as a graduate student in, I don't remember if it was in a seminar, but I think it was more in terms of hearing my professors at these dinners when they would start gossiping about colleagues, as professors are wont to do. And the topic of René Girard came up not frequently, but not infrequently either, because this was the heyday of deconstruction.
Oh yes, I remember that.
And as you know from your time at Cornell, Romance Studies was one of the bastions of deconstructionism.
Absolutely.
And of course, the challenge that René's thought represented with respect to deconstruction is that where Derrida and the minions, whenever they saw anything that looked like identity, they would deconstruct it to show that difference was underneath it. René is, so I first heard about him as someone who intrigued me as taking a rather contrary approach, that wherever he sees difference, he looked for the common identity underlying the difference, and this mimetic anxiety about differentiation. Right. The book that people were talking about mostly at that time was Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, in which he took this big leap from his earlier work into a kind of prophetic mode about the Christian kerygma. And I don't recall being particularly influenced by René's thought at the time. I was intrigued by it, and it appealed to me. But it was only much later, when I got to know him personally, that I delved into his work in a more systematic, comprehensive way.
So when you were at Cornell, Diacritic put out an issue on him.
Yes.
Were you there when that happened?
Yes, and in fact, I now that you mention it, that was one of the nodal points around which a lot of this discussion concerning René was located. So yeah, right. Definitely the diacritics issue.
Okay. So then when did you meet him first?
I met him when I became a professor at Stanford, my beginning assistant professorship in the 80s, mid 80s, when I arrived at Stanford. And let me backtrack actually, because in addition to those conversations I was referring to, John Fricero, the Dante scholar,
yes,
came to Cornell to teach a seminar on Dante, which I followed as a graduate student. John Fricero had recently been very instrumental in getting René Girard hired at Stanford University.
Correct.
So my first job out of graduate school was in the Department of Italian at Stanford, and I was hired by John Fricero, and I became René Girard's colleague at the time. And we immediately became friends, also through the connection with Michel Serres, who was brought to Stanford by René Girard for a permanent visiting kind of appointment, where he would come for 1 quarter a year every year. And there was a group of us that were francophone and very, and there was a lot of camaraderie. I'm referring now not only to René Girard, Michel Serres, but Brigitte Cazel, the medievalist, oh, yes. Brigitte Cazel, now deceased, Pierre Saint-Amand, and myself. And this was a kind of coterie of people in the Department of French and Italian that got together a lot, and that there was a great attunement between us. And I got to know René not from a distance as, you know, the great theorist, as much as I got to know him up close also as a person and a human being.
How was he? I mean, big stars are big stars after all. So when I met him, I was not quite sure who I was going to meet. I mean, I had met all these big stars like Jacques Derrida, and he was such a big star and everything. So I was not quite sure who I was going to walk into his office when I first made an appointment to go see him, and I was kind of hesitant. Such a big star. So what was your first encounter when you met him? Such a big star. He was a big star when you met him, didn't he? Wasn't he?
Well, sure. And we're talking about the mid '80s. He was a very big star, and we also had two important colloquia that took place at Stanford after I arrived.
Right.
On his work, multidisciplinary.
Right.
I am going to guess that when you met him, not knowing what to expect, you found a great intellectual and renowned person who was very not modest is the wrong word, but who was very relaxed, without pretension, and without
absolutely.
Without
you got it. You hit it right on the nail. Absolutely, Robert.
That's René. That was also Michel Serres. Both of them were completely devoid of grandstanding. The opposite of Jacques Derrida, who never took a mask off.
Right.
His face that I was aware of. Yeah, so there was we had a lot of fun together, and René was smoking at that time, a casual smoker. I was more than a casual smoker, and I would be providing him cigarettes. So and in those days you could smoke in your office and in the buildings. So we would in his office usually. Donne-moi une cigarette, and then we would smoke, and others would come, and so the conversation was ongoing with René.
This was on the quad at that point, or were you guys in the trailer in the 80s?
No, this is before the earthquake, so we're talking about the quad in building 60 on the second floor.
Great. Yeah. Okay.
And of course, Bob Cohen was part of the department at that time.
Right.
And if you have any recollection, Bob Cohen was so jealous and resentful of René's stature and the fact that René had a private secretary, Margret Tompkins, that he just engaged in this constant sort of guerrilla warfare against René. And René would kind of laugh it off, and he, the last person to fall into any kind of, rivalry of that sort was René. So we had a lot of fun reading Bob Cohen's letters to the Stanford Daily, and the fits that he would have in the office. I'm more famous than that son of a bitch. I don't know. Yeah, he was a big Malabé scholar, no. So now you're making me remember these when being an academic was a lot of fun. Plunged into a permanent clinical depression since then, in academia. But
no, but when I came into I came to the French department from the theater department. Yeah. And my first advisor was Jean-Marie Apostolides.
Jean-Marie Apostolides,
and Apostolides was another one who envied Girard quite a bit.
Yes.
And he was always telling me, watch out for Girard, watch out for Girard. He's a papiste. So he had this paranoia about the Catholic Church and Girard. So
are you interviewing Jean-Marie for this show?
No.
Okay.
It's best.
Jean-Marie arrived a little bit later than I did, I think 2 or 3 years later. And he quickly became the chairman of the department for some reason.
Right.
And his primary objective was to de-Girardianize the department, as he put it.
Right.
He didn't want it to be a department founded on. It was the biggest mistake that not only Jean-Marie made, but the whole department made, which was this paranoid, anti-clerical, purblind reaction against the major thinker
Sure.
and intellectual of the department.
Right.
And these kinds of petty rivalries that were exemplified by people like Jean-Marie and Bob Cohen and stuff, they did nothing but exemplify in vivid terms a lot of the theories that of human mimetic desire that René is famous for.
Right. Absolutely. And I heard a lot that Jean-Marie was trying to forbid graduate students who wanted to come to the department to work with Girard, and Jean-Marie, being the chair, stood in front of it to rebuke all those graduate students, I heard. So
the damage, look, I have to say that it's one thing to laugh off, the psychic quirks of people like Jean-Marie, but not. On the other hand, there was real damage done, I think, to the department as well as to René's foundational, institutional basis of
right.
mimetic theory by a chairman who would have this neuralgic reaction when it came to Girard. And his heir in that respect is our colleague Joshua Landy, who, if you mention René Girard, it's like he needs an exorcism, because he goes into a conniption whenever the name René Girard is mentioned. And it's unfortunate because, as you know, René was not by any measure confrontational, nor hostile, nor mean, nor malicious of any sort. And yet he provoked a lot of rather
resentments.
Yeah, resentments and even malice, downright malice. Yeah.
But he amazingly dealt with it very well. He really dealt with it in a very Christ-like manner.
He did. I'm not sure myself whether René's detractors were more detrimental to his, his project than his devoted disciples. Because I think the many Girardians, all of whom I'm friends with, most of whom I know well, and certainly, but there's a way in which, as Nietzsche has an aphorism somewhere, that every party has certain people whose excessive zeal provokes all the others to apostasy. Mm-hmm. So there is a certain kind of excessive zeal among some of the Girardians that make one want to recoil from being identified as a kind of pure Girardian. But that is another part of René's institutional context that makes, complicates things also a little bit.
Well, ultimately, I hope it balances things off, because you have Girardians all over the world. You have Girardians in Italy, as you well know.
Yes.
People like Pier Paolo Antonello, who I just interviewed for the film. And you have people in Austria, you have people in Germany, you have it all over the world. So it doesn't have to be only America or France.
Oh, absolutely. And Pier Paolo, I know well, he was my student. He
okay.
Did dissertation with me, and he's, one of the top Girardians and one of the real good Girardians.
Girardians. I love the book he wrote with Pierre César, Conversion and what is it called? Conversion, Evolution and Conversion.
Yes, Evolution and Conversion.
I think that's one of the best books that came out.
I agree with you. I really agree with you. And I have to say that I think that the passing away of René has done a lot, and is starting to do a lot to make René's legacy and thought and corpus. It's disburdened the corpus from all of the peripheral personal jealousies and resentments of his colleagues and ex-colleagues and so forth, and the fact that you don't have a living person to attack and to mock or whatever. I think now that there's a much more sober reassessment of what is the enormous value. He was much beloved, and that is finally much more important than even, you know, the thought and contributions he made on the intellectual level. The fact that he was a genuine and generous human being that inspired a great deal of love, which is not just devotion. There are a lot of bastards who have devoted disciples.
Absolutely.
Devotion is not the best measure. Love is the best measure, and affection. And everyone who knew René, even those who are allergic to his theory, have a certain kind of affection and love for him. Even my colleague Josh Landy, who has a lot of trouble with Girard's theories, still was very fond of him, came to the funeral and so forth. So the other associations, I had more institutional associations with him as well. Often, well, let me mention that I chaired the Department of French and Italian for over 7 years. And during that period, there were 2 or 3 major events that I sponsored. One was a retirement colloquium for René, where I got funds from the administration, kind of generous funds to have an international conference and bring people from around the world. And we had a very high-powered group of scholars that came and gave talks, at which René would get up and respond to and engage each one in real time. And it was a magnificent 2 or 3 day retirement conference that was full of the spirit that you were referring to, of a kind of affectionate, sympathetic love for him. And then also when he was inducted into the Académie Française, I was able to go over with some of our colleagues and sponsor a dinner after the ceremony for about 30 people. In those days, Stanford, you know, was alla grande, as they say in Italian, you know, those kind of things, very hard to come by these days. And then when the ceremony was over, we had another big kind of university-wide ceremonies, a celebration ceremony at the Cantor Museum for his induction into the Académie Française. Subsequent to that, he came often to our philosophical reading group, where we would read essays of his or ask him to speak about a text that we were reading. I remember a magnificent one on Genesis. He came to speak about Genesis and the book of Job and various other things, and also Shakespeare. We had a reading group on Shakespeare, and he came to that as well. So
this is after he retired?
Yes.
I missed that.
Yeah, after he retired. Yeah.
It was phenomenal with Shakespeare and the Bible. I've never seen anyone else like him. He had so much passion. When I first met him, he said, it's all in Shakespeare. Everything is in Shakespeare. But then by the end, he said, everything is in the Bible. Everything is in the Bible.
I had lunch with René maybe once a week, or let's say 3 times a month at least, at the faculty club for years and years on end.
Right.
And that was in addition to seeing him often, just because Michel Serres would stay at René's house when he was here.
Right.
And go pick up Michel and spend time at the Girards or have dinner there. But we had this thing where at least 2 to 3 times a month, we would have lunch just one-on-one. And it would go on for an hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes, just and talk about everything from Joseph to the back guy to politics in America and literature. It was you could not have a more interesting interlocutor to have lunch with than René. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The more you deal with literature and read it in light of what one's exposure to the Girardian theory, the more Girard keeps coming back as relevant.
Robert, do you have a favorite book of his?
Well,
I mean, I have a feeling you do, but I want to see if it's the same.
you know, I have to say that I was asked to do an article on René Girard for the New York Review of Books,
Okay.
which came out over a year ago. It was, I think, a year and a half ago. And I reread a number of books of his. And then I read one that I had not read, which was the last one about...
Battling to the End?
Yes, Battling to the End, about Clausewitz. And I won't say that that's my favorite book, but I think that that book is, maybe because I hadn't read it before, it struck me as full of insight and relevance to our contemporary political situations. And it made me regret the fact that he had not spent more time thinking or applying his ideas to, you know, contemporary political realities the way he did in that book.
He shied away from that.
He shied away from it, and maybe he was right to shy away from it. On the other hand, you look at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in those years, and there was such a Girardian element about that, no?
Yeah.
You say that the madness of reciprocal violence is something that you have to attain an awareness of being trapped in it in order to free yourself from it. The Clausewitz book, Battling to the End, I found enlightening about war and modern warfare and how you battle to the end, and the madness of the reciprocal violence syndrome. I have to say the Shakespeare book appeals to me a great deal because it takes the mimetic theory and puts it in practice in a corpus like Shakespeare, and I find it much more compelling than even, you know, his first book on deceit, desire, and the novel.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought my guess would have been that you like Deceit, Desire, and the novel.
I'm not crazy about the deceit, desire, and the novel, to tell you the truth, because I find that it's a little too overladen with a theoretical apparatus or language, not apparatus, but a language of you know, a metaphysics of deficiency, and it's also, you know, with the diagrams and the triangles and things like that. However, I'm not a big reader. I mean, I've read, but how can I say I'm not a big fan of the 19th century novel? It will sound like I'm such a someone from the provinces. But I'm not a big fan of those long books that he uses as his case studies.
Right.
Whether it's you know, Stendhal's Chateau de Parme, or whether it's Proust. I'm not a lover of Proust, and so anyway, that might have created a little bit of difficulty for me to get into it. The theory, you know, obviously is there, but I find that in Shakespeare it's so much more alive for me because I see it on stage.
Sure. But he
yeah.
had to develop it somewhere. He had to start from it. So that's why Deceit, Desire, and the novel is the beginning.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely crucial. I understand its foundational importance for everything that comes afterwards.
Right.
But if you ask me which one I reread with pleasure, it's the Shakespeare book.
Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The
book?
Theater of Envy, yes.
Theater of Envy, right.
The Theater of Envy. What he has to say about Hamlet, you have all these Shakespeareans, that play has been endlessly commented on, and the way he just shows very is so straightforwardly that Hamlet overcomes his psychological paralysis only when he sees, you know, his rival acting and enacting and dramatizing, and then he just starts imitating him. Anyway.
All right, good. Do you have any memories of Martha Girard and the Girard family? Did you spend any time with them throughout all these years at Stanford?
Yes, I spent a lot of time with Martha and René, and Martha subsequent to René passing away, because I also, in a certain sense, have been the caretaker of his institutional memory at Stanford, even after I was no longer chairing the department. And I have been a champion of Cynthia Haven, for example, who wrote the biography of René, The Evolution of Desire.
Yeah.
And she is also very close with Martha Girard, and I also sponsored a book event for that purpose, in which we talked about René and his work and biography, and Martha was always a part of that.
Wonderful, wonderful, excellent. Yeah. So you still are you still working with the Italian Girardians? I saw you had Calasso on one of your interviews. You brought Calasso in to talk at Girard.
Brought Calasso to Stanford to give a talk. Yes, and I also got to know Calasso. I went to see him in Milan in order to organize a conversation between Roberto Calasso and René Girard at Stanford that almost came to fruition, but somehow there were some logistical difficulties that made it not happen. But I had been, that would have been a great conversation to have had and converse. So there's Roberto Calasso, there's Pier Paolo Antonello, and then there are other Italian Girardians.
Giuseppe Fornari, do you know him?
Yes, I know Fornari, and I know Fabrizio Falconi, another Girardian. And also my colleague Laura Whitman, who is an Italianist as well as French scholar. She does French and Italian, professor of
Where
French.
at? Where at?
Here at Stanford.
Okay.
She is, she's not an Orthodox Girardienne, but she is, Girard is very important for some of her work. And so the Girard is alive and well in Italy, very much so.
That's what I hear. That's what I hear. So I'm exploring that route. So I would like to explore the Italians. I really would like to.
And not only that, I have to tell you, Ak, that when I teach Dante, which I do always with pleasure and as often as I can, Girard is always someone I bring up, because he is the single most useful critic whose theory applies most pertinently to the Divine Comedy, at least to hell, the Inferno. And this is something that Michel Serres would also say about René, is that no one understands le mal better than
René does.
But Michel wanted to be the thinker of le paradis and le bien. But it's impossible to read the Inferno and know René's work in depth and not see Girardianism working itself out constantly in the Inferno. And I'm sure that that's what so enthralled John Frachero in the thought of René Girard. They were friends from before, in Hopkins and so forth.
Hopkins, yeah.
John Frachero is the one who brought him to Stanford.
Right.
and was one of the great early champions of his theories, I think, because he saw that what René was saying was at work at every turn in Dante's Inferno.
Tell me something. In Inferno, is there more than the triangular desire that he talks about between Beatrice and his lover? I mean, do we have scapegoating in the Inferno? I don't remember.
Well, I think that what you have in the Inferno is it's mostly the mimetic theory, but it's not so much the mimetic desire of romantic love, le mensonge romanesque, that you have in Paolo and Francesca in Canto 5. I mean, you can't teach that Canto 5 of the Inferno and not, tell your students all about René Girard. And they all get fascinated, by the way, but it's when you get into the deeper recesses of hell, at the very bottom of hell, where you have these enemies and the way that they are reciprocally taking revenge upon themselves, and that are locked in these cycles of not only reciprocal violence, but a constant escalation of the violence and the logic of revenge. The lower depths of the Dante's Inferno is a place of terrible escalation of reciprocal violence, and it's very intense and very satanic in the way that René understood the satanic. So, yeah. So it's much more than just the mimetic triangle.
Right. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I never thought about that, because the only thing I had heard about was the mimetic triangle of Beatrice and the lover. But
Paolo and Francesca, yeah.
Paolo and Francesca, right. Paolo and Francesca, that's the only thing I had known about that. But you're right, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I was teaching at Columbia, the Inferno, as part of their great course.
Yes.
Now that you're mentioning it, you're absolutely right. When you get to the lower level, it's total reciprocation of violence. Absolutely.
When you have Ugolino, who is trapped in the same hole as his archenemy,
yeah,
who was Ruggieri, the Archbishop Ruggieri, and he's gnawing at his head in this kind of endless hatred. And he says, and Dante said, tell me why you are in this gesture with such a bestial sign, as Dante said. And he says, I will tell you, and I'll tell you why I am such a neighbor to him. The word neighbor, perché io son tal vicino, this idea that neighborly love that turns into, from communion you go to cannibalism, through a logic of this kind of identity in reciprocity and violence. This is something that you need René to help you, articulate the logic of this completely demonic logic of it. And that's why the students who take my Dante courses all go away with a pretty solid understanding of the foundations of René's theories.
Phenomenal. I wish I had taken your course, Robert. I wish I had taken your course. I missed your course. I need to come back and take your course on Dante. That would be...
Yes, but at the time that you were here, I might not have been emphasizing those aspects of the poem, because I was more interested in maybe the philosophical and the literary and the psychological. The politics of the poem have become much more compelling to me in the last decade than before. And that's where the tribal ethnic violence and kind of family feuds and so forth. There are a lot of parts that I would skip over that now I think are the most important parts. And that's where the Girardianism is most intense.
Are you working on anything Girardian in your books, or do you have any Girardian project on your hand?
I don't have, however much, I am sold on Girard's theories and so forth. I have not, I don't have, he doesn't enter into my work very often. And it's only because I'm
Is it out of respect that you're kind of keeping him at a?
No, not really. It's because my center of gravity as an intellectual has been the natural world, or the relationship between culture and nature, and where the intersection of the two, and René was singularly uninterested in the natural world, to tell you the truth. That's not a limitation, it's just that the social world.
Yeah, the
was,
Darwin.
hmm?
Darwin.
Yes, exactly.
Anthropology and classics, and yeah, I understand.
He was interested in maybe the ethological foundation, that mimetic behavior among chimpanzees and things of that sort, but it was always the social world.
Social world, right.
Not the natural world, and not even very much the political world. He was interested in the political world more for what it said about the social relations, you know? Yeah. And, one of the great, I'm not going to call it tragedies, but one of the things that it's really a shame is that René was not around to give us insight into this huge explosion of social media. Because if there's one thing that vindicates and verifies so much of his insights, it's the mimetic contagion of social media and Facebook and so forth.
Well, he was around for Facebook, wasn't he? He was around for Facebook. But he didn't use it.
It was early enough that he was not able to see the extent to which
explosion of it. Yeah.
I think Facebook was founded in 2005.
Right.
So, and he was already out of touch with contemporary culture by that point, and people around like me, it took a while for even the rest of us to realize that this complete silliness was going to take over the whole world.
Yeah. Good. All right, Professor Harrison, it was very kind of you to take your time and participate in this tribute film. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you soon.
Very good to talk to you and see you after all this time, Babak.
Indeed, it was. It's good to know you from Cornell, and it was good to see you at René Girard's funeral mass in 2015, and here we are.
Yeah, and you stay well.
You too as well, and I will hopefully see you soon.
Okay, take care.
Okay.